Thank you so much, and very nice to be here this afternoon and to be part of this very important discussion on Ukraine. So, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to severe humanitarian sufferings, economic and political consequences, and I think they have been well described by so many other speakers, also highlighting in a very good way all the gaps and all the consequences. So I will not spend time on repeating that. My reflection is that it's really important, but also very impressive to see the resilience of the Ukrainian economy and that the country is able to work on reforms, recovery, and reconstruction actually in the middle of a war. And I also think if you look upon it from an opportunity perspective, the reconstruction will actually also provide an opportunity to modernize Ukraine's economy. And there are so many assets, I think, to build on. Ukraine has a well-educated and skilled population, a strong industrial base to build on. And if you look on the resilience of the private sector, it's really remarkable, where still a very large share of companies are operating and planning for the future. And of course, as we have heard, there are companies where personnel or infrastructure have been impacted. But according to a study that I read from the EBRD, only 6% have been forced to suspend their operations, which I think, considering the circumstances, is really remarkable. Before I became the CEO of Swedfund, I worked for almost 20 years in Hakansson. So I have a long experience from the IT and digitalization sector. And I think the IT sector is really a good example of a sector that has quickly adapted in Ukraine and that really has shown that it is resilient. And if I understand it correctly, it actually also shown growth in 2022. So, of course, I'm therefore very proud that Swedfund, together with a number of other DFIs, have invested in SMEs in the IT sector through the fund Horizon Capital. And really what we want to achieve as an investor here is to contribute to an increased access of growth capital, to really enable these companies to continue their growth journey, to create jobs. And I think also it has good effect for the country because it will also contribute to increased export revenues, access to hard currency, and also tax revenues. For me, on a more personal note, it provided me with an opportunity to visit Kyiv at the end of April. And it is a city that in my previous capacity then at Hakansson has actually visited quite a number of times. And it was so good to see that Kyiv is still a very lively city. And I was extremely impressed by the strong and resilient companies that I met during these days. And I think this is a good example of exactly what you're talking about in this previous presentation. It really testifies to the competence and potential in the IT sector that we see in Ukraine, but also the role that DFIs like Swedfund can play in providing risk-willing and long-term capital to really enable entrepreneurs and SMEs to grow and scale their business. I think in our role as DFIs, we are also extremely important in that we are additional, that we are willing to take the risk and actually go into and make investments happen. And by that also actually providing that extremely important link and bridge to the private capital that you were highlighting in the previous slides. We were also very honored that when we were in Kyiv for the signing ceremony, President Zelensky attended the ceremony. And he underlined the importance of trust and of investors really leading the way and showing that it's possible to make investments and that Ukraine is really open for business. And I really share that view that it's extremely important to provide those extremely concrete examples. In some of the previous slides, we have seen examples of sectors where there are huge needs. And I think it's also what are those specific investments? Are there good examples to share? And if you look on the DFIs, you can in one way say that we are impact investors. For us, the starting point is really what is the impact that we can create in terms of jobs, access to essential services like electricity or food or financial services, but also how we can, for example, invest in areas like digitalization to really accelerate the development. So that's where we start. Then I think the other part, if you talk about ESG that you mentioned, Marina, I think it's extremely important that things are done in a sustainable way. It's both from the environmental perspective, it's that it's socially done, that we really can offer decent working conditions. And then, of course, always extremely important to address the governance and the anti-corruption measures. And I think for us, what we see is this is where we can really contribute. It's in normal cases for us as a DFI, the area where we see that the risks can be very high, but also an area where we can really contribute and add value. So I think the other side of the DFI is not only from a capital perspective, but really what we can see is that we come in. We normally say that our capital comes with requirements, but also with support. And by working with different companies on actually improving the way they work with ESG, we, in a one way, also become a quality stamp for other investors, whether it's institutional investors or other impact investors, saying that when a DFI has been there, we have really helped to really address those questions, making sure that there are actually capabilities and competence, because it's not around the measurements. I think it's extremely important to make sure that the companies that we invest in, that we really equip them to work with those questions. And I think just on a side note, we saw after the pandemic that those companies that have really worked with ESG in a structured way, they actually manage much more better financially. And I think that has to do with having a very structured approach to how you actually work with risks, but also with value creation. So it's the impact, it's the sustainability, which is really the how you do it. And then the third area is that, I mean, when we invest, we want it to be financially viable. Because if that is not there, then, I mean, all of the efforts that we put in will be in vain unless we can really see that there is, I mean, a runway to a positive return and to positive cash flows. And I think it's also extremely important because that is required if we want to attract all of that different capital. So if I look at Ukraine, I think, and I can only, I mean, agree upon that there is a huge need, but I also see that there is a huge potential in many sectors. But what needs to happen is, I mean, there's many different actors that will need to come together. And it's, I mean, it's an extraordinary situation. So it will also require something extra from all of us. I fully share the important view actually having concessional financing, because I think for all of us, even for DFIs, there is a need for risk mitigation. And I think that is key to get that piece into the puzzle. And I also think the war or the insurance part is extremely important to resolve. But all in all, I think if we're going to resolve this, I think it's actually a collaboration between both public and private actors that is needed. And I think it's extremely important that we find different kind of vehicles where we can coordinate this work. And I think at the end of the day, it has to be the needs of Ukraine that is the guiding light for all of us. That's kind of what determines where the money goes. So from a DFI perspective, I mean, we find Ukraine very important and very interesting. So we have done the investments as I described in Horizon Capital, but we also made investments in Ukraine even before the war, then mostly in renewable energy. And in general, the sectors we focus on are energy and climate. It is digitalization. It is financial inclusion, which is from a broader perspective, actually to increase access to funding to SMEs. And then we do what we call more sustainable enterprises, where we also include thematic areas like the food sector and healthcare services.